Her ex-husband called her fat, his words dripping with the same cruelty she had endured for 10 years. He thought he saw a woman who had let herself go, a pathetic remnant of the life he'd left behind. He meant to break her, to remind her that she was worthless without him. What he couldn't see was the secret she was protecting with every fiber of her being. He didn't know she was pregnant with the child of one of the country's most powerful billionaires. He thought he was looking at a ghost from his past, but he was about to discover her real story was just beginning. The scent of roasted coffee beans and over-sugared pastries usually brought Olivia a sense of calm, a small, affordable luxury in a life that had been stripped of them. But today, the cloying sweetness in the air at the daily grind only made the nausea churn in her stomach. It was a constant companion these days, a reminder of the secret she guarded with every fiber of her being. At 4 months, her body was beginning to betray her. The loose-fitting sweater she'd chosen this morning felt tighter than she'd like, a soft prison of wool that couldn't quite hide the gentle swell of her belly. She was just about to pay for her decaf latte when the voice sliced through the cafe's morning chatter, a voice she hadn't heard in 6 months, yet one that could still make the hairs on her arms stand on end. Well, look what the cat dragged in. Olivia froze, her hand hovering over her wallet. It couldn't be. Not here. Not now. She slowly turned, her heart thudding against her ribs like a trapped bird. There he was, David, leaning against the counter with the same infuriating smirk he'd worn for the better part of their 10-year marriage. He looked exactly the same to her, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than her rent, his dark hair perfectly styled. She saw the same handsome face, marred by a cruelty she knew all too well, flickering in his blue eyes. He ran his gaze over her, a slow, deliberate act of appraisal that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. His eyes lingered on her midsection, and his smirk widened into a sneer. "Letting yourself go, Liv? I always told you those bakery trips would catch up with you. You look comfortable." The word hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Comfortable. In David's vocabulary, it was synonymous with sloppy, unattractive, and, worst of all, fat. It was the same word he'd used when she'd been too exhausted from working 2 jobs to support his failing business ventures to get dressed up for his clients. The same word he'd whispered in her ear after she'd given up her dreams of opening a small art gallery to become the perfect, supportive wife he'd demanded. Her cheeks burned with a familiar shame, a conditioned response she despised. For a moment, she was transported back to their sterile, minimalist apartment, to the countless nights she'd stood in front of the mirror, pinching at her skin, hearing his voice in her head, telling her she wasn't enough. But then, a tiny, fluttering sensation deep within her womb brought her back to the present. It was a flicker of life, a secret promise. This wasn't just her body anymore. She wasn't just the woman David had spent a decade trying to break. Straightening her spine, she met his gaze, forcing a calmness into her voice she didn't feel. "David." What a surprise. "Is it?" he asked, pushing himself off the counter and taking a step closer. He smelled of expensive cologne and entitlement. "It's a small town. I heard you were still around, scraping by. Working at that little bookstore, are we? How poetic. From gallery owner to minimum wage clerk. Quite the fall from grace." Every word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to wound. He knew her dream of owning a gallery had been the first thing she'd sacrificed for him. He had encouraged her to, calling it a hobby and not a real career. "I like my job," she said, her voice tight. "It's quiet. The people are nice." "Unlike you," she left unsaid. "Right," he scoffed, his eyes once again raking over her body. "Seems like you've gotten a bit too comfortable with the quiet life. You should watch that. A woman on her own needs to keep up appearances. You never know who you might meet." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Though in that sweater, I'm guessing it won't be anyone of consequence." The insult was so deeply personal, so quintessentially David, that it almost felt unreal. He was a master of the subtle cut, the public humiliation disguised as friendly advice. He didn't just want to hurt her, he wanted to diminish her, to remind her that in his world she was, and always would be, nothing. He saw her as his failed project, a woman he had molded and then discarded when she no longer served his purpose. Their divorce had been his idea, a swift, brutal affair where he'd made it clear she was an embarrassment, a weight holding him back from the success he was so certain he deserved. For a heart-stopping second, Olivia felt the primal urge to scream the truth at him, to wipe that smug look off his face with the one fact that would shatter his entire perception of her. "This isn't fat, you arrogant fool. I'm pregnant." But she couldn't. It wasn't his business. And more importantly, the father of her child was a man whose world was so far removed from David's petty universe that the two could scarcely exist on the same planet. Explaining her connection to Alexander Sterling would be impossible, and inviting David's poison into that fragile, beautiful part of her life was unthinkable. Alexander. The thought of his name was like a shield. His kindness, his quiet strength, the way his eyes held nothing but warmth when he looked at her. He had never once made her feel small. He had touched the scars David left on her soul and hadn't flinched. He had called her beautiful, not just in spite of her perceived flaws, but because of the strength he saw in her. Drawing on that memory, Olivia gave David a small, tight-lipped smile. "Thanks for the advice, David, but I'm happy. I don't need to keep up appearances for anyone." She turned back to the barista, paid for her latte, and walked away, feeling his eyes burning into her back with every step. She didn't look back. As the cafe door chimed shut behind her, she took a deep, shaky breath, her hand instinctively coming to rest on her belly. The encounter had left her trembling, but not broken. This time he hadn't won. He had thrown his sharpest stones, but they had bounced off an armor he didn't know she had. He thought he was looking at a lonely, defeated ex-wife who'd let herself go. He had no idea he was looking at a woman who was carrying a billionaire's child. And for the first time in a very long time, Olivia felt a surge of power that was entirely her own. David was a ghost from a past life. Her future was just beginning. The walk to the small independent bookstore where she worked was usually a balm for Olivia's soul. She loved the historic brick buildings of Charleston's French Quarter, the scent of Confederate jasmine that clung to the wrought iron fences, and the gentle clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages. But after the encounter with David, the familiar streets felt different, haunted by the ghosts of their shared past. Every corner held a memory, a reminder of the life she had once thought was her own. She remembered walking these same streets, her hand tucked in the crook of David's arm, feeling like the luckiest woman in the world. He had been so charming back then, a whirlwind of ambition and promises. He'd painted a picture of a glorious future, with her by his side, the elegant and cultured wife of a successful entrepreneur. She, a talented art history graduate with a fiery passion and a small inheritance, had been captivated. He'd made her feel seen, cherished, or so she had thought. The reality of their marriage had been a slow, insidious erosion of her sense of self. It hadn't started with overt cruelty, but with small, almost unnoticeable manipulations. Her dream of opening a contemporary art gallery was the first casualty. "It's too risky, Liv," he'd said, his tone laced with a patronizing concern that she'd mistaken for love. "Let me get my tech startup off the ground first. Once we're stable, you can play with your little hobby." So she'd waited. She'd used her inheritance not to lease a gallery space, but to fund his business, to pay for their beautifully decorated, emotionally sterile apartment, to buy the designer clothes he insisted she wear to impress his potential investors. She became his prop, his support system, the unpaid assistant who organized his life while hers was put on hold. The power imbalance was subtle at first. He controlled the finances, dismissing her questions with a wave of his hand. "Don't worry your pretty little head about it," he'd say. He began to critique her friends, her clothes, her opinions. He'd do it with a smile, framing it as helpful advice. "That dress is a bit loud, don't you think? You have such a classic beauty. You don't need to shout for attention." Soon she found herself dressing only in muted colors, speaking only when spoken to at his business dinners, her once vibrant personality fading into a pale imitation of the woman he wanted her to be. The verbal jabs about her weight had started after his first company failed. He needed someone to blame, and she was the closest target. It began with comments about the groceries she bought, then escalated to remarks about her figure in front of their friends. He would pat her stomach playfully at parties and say, "Looks like someone's been enjoying her desserts," getting a laugh from the crowd while she died a little inside. She'd started skipping meals, running until her legs ached, desperately trying to reclaim the body he had deemed unacceptable. But it was never enough. The goalposts were always moving. He wasn't critiquing her body, he was attacking her spirit. The end had come swiftly. After his second business went under, taking the last of her inheritance with it, he announced he was leaving. He told her she was a millstone around his neck, that her lack of ambition had dragged him down. He packed his expensive suits and left her in the apartment they could no longer afford, with nothing but a mountain of debt and a shattered sense of self. The months that followed had been a blur of grief and humiliation. She'd found the job at the Book Nook, a quiet haven filled with the scent of aging paper and the comforting weight of stories. It was there, hidden amongst the shelves of poetry and classic literature, that she had begun to piece herself back together. And it was there she had met Alexander Sterling. He hadn't looked like a billionaire. He'd walked in one rainy Tuesday afternoon, dressed in a simple grey Henley and dark jeans, his dark blonde hair damp from the weather. He had the kind of quiet intensity that made you notice him without him demanding it. He'd been looking for a rare first-edition copy of a Walt Whitman collection. Olivia, a lover of Whitman, had struck up a conversation with him. They'd talked for nearly an hour, about poetry, about art, about the quiet beauty of a rainy day in Charleston. He never once mentioned his name or what he did. He was just a man with kind eyes and a gentle soul who listened, truly listened, to what she had to say. He came back the next week, and the week after that. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. She found herself telling him about her failed marriage, about the gallery she had dreamed of, about the feeling of being invisible. He never pitied her. Instead, he looked at her with a profound respect that she hadn't felt in years. "It takes a special kind of strength to survive something like that and still be able to find beauty in a poem," he'd told her, his voice soft. It was only after their third chance meeting that he'd properly introduced himself. He'd handed her a card, his name embossed in simple, elegant script, Alexander Sterling. She hadn't recognized it at first. It was only later, when her curiosity got the better of her and she'd searched for him online, that the truth had hit her with the force of a physical blow. Sterling Industries, real estate, tech, philanthropy. He was one of the wealthiest, most private men in the country, with a sprawling historic estate just outside of Charleston. She had been terrified. She'd almost convinced herself not to see him again, certain that she was out of her depth, that a man like him could never be genuinely interested in a woman like her. But he'd shown up at the bookstore again, a hopeful look in his eyes, and she'd agreed to have dinner with him. That first date was a revelation. He treated her not as a conquest, but as an equal. He asked for her opinion on his latest philanthropic project, listened intently to her ideas about promoting local artists, and laughed at her jokes. When she'd nervously confessed how intimidated she was by his wealth, he'd grown serious. "Olivia," he'd said, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his, "that's what I do. It's not who I am. Who I am is a man who hasn't been able to stop thinking about your passion for art since the day I met you." Their relationship had blossomed quietly, away from the prying eyes of the world he inhabited. He was patient, understanding, and unerringly kind. He helped her heal the wounds David had inflicted, not by trying to fix her, but by simply loving her as she was. He'd trace the stretch marks on her hips and call them beautiful. He'd listen to her business plans for a small, community-focused art space and tell her they were brilliant. When she'd found out she was pregnant, she had been terrified. It was an accident, a complication she was sure would send him running. Instead, when she'd told him, his face had broken into a smile so radiant it had taken her breath away. He had pulled her into his arms and whispered, "This is the best news I've ever heard." Now, standing on the sidewalk, the memory of David's sneer fresh in her mind, Olivia clutched her coat tighter. David had trapped her in a gilded cage, convincing her she was worthless without him. Alexander, a man who could give her any gilded cage she wanted, had instead handed her the key and shown her how to fly. David's insult this morning had been about her weight, about her appearance. But he was wrong. Her changing body wasn't a sign that she was letting herself go. It was a testament to a new life, a new love, and a future he couldn't even begin to imagine. Alexander Sterling's estate, a magnificent antebellum mansion named Riverwood, was nestled amidst acres of ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss. It was a world away from the cramped, modern apartment Olivia had shared with David. The first time Alexander had brought her here, she had felt an overwhelming sense of imposter syndrome, as if she were a commoner who had stumbled into a king's palace. The long gravel drive, the towering white columns, the hushed elegance of the interior, it was all designed to project an aura of immense power and old money. But Alexander had a way of making even the grandest of spaces feel intimate. He rarely used the cavernous formal dining room, preferring instead to eat with her in the cozy, sun-drenched breakfast nook that overlooked the sprawling gardens. He didn't have a legion of servants hovering over them. There was only Mrs. Gable, a kind, grandmotherly housekeeper who had been with his family for decades and treated Olivia with a quiet, respectful warmth. Tonight, a fire crackled in the grand fireplace of the library, casting a warm, flickering glow over the thousands of leather-bound books that lined the walls. The room smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and the faint, clean scent of the night-blooming jasmine drifting in through the open French doors. Olivia was curled on one end of a plush velvet sofa, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands. Alexander sat on the floor at her feet, his back against the sofa, gently massaging her swollen ankles. His touch was firm but gentle, a stark contrast to David's, which had always been possessive, demanding. Alexander's touch was a question, a comfort, an act of service. He hadn't said much since she'd recounted the encounter with her ex-husband, but she could feel a tension in his shoulders, a protective anger that seemed to simmer just beneath his calm exterior. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. He looked up at her, his hazel eyes dark with what looked like deep concern. "No one has the right to speak to you that way, least of all him." "It's okay," Olivia murmured, though her stomach was still in knots. "I'm used to it. That's just David." "It's not okay," Alexander insisted, his grip on her ankle tightening ever so slightly. "What he did to you was unforgivable. The way he diminished you, the way he tried to extinguish your light. I see the ghost of it sometimes, in the way you second-guess yourself, in the way you flinch when you think you've made a mistake." He sighed, his gaze softening. "I just want to build a world for you where his voice can't reach you anymore." Tears pricked her eyes. He saw her so clearly, understood the invisible wounds she still carried. With David, she had always felt like she had to perform, to be a perfect, flawless version of herself. With Alexander, she could just be. She could be tired, or nauseous, or sad, and his affection for her never wavered. She set her tea aside and slid down to the floor to sit beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. He immediately wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "He just has a way of getting under my skin," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "He called me fat, Alex, and for one horrible second I believed him. "I forgot about this," she said, placing a hand on her belly, and all I could feel was that old shame. Alexander turned, his hand covering hers. "This is the most beautiful thing in the world," he whispered, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "You are the most beautiful woman in the world. You're growing our child. There is nothing more powerful or more incredible than that. David is a small, bitter man, and his words are meaningless." She knew he was right, but the psychological conflict was immense. A decade of conditioning couldn't be erased in a few months, no matter how wonderful her new reality was. Part of her was still that woman who checked the scale every morning, who counted calories, who measured her worth by the number on a clothing tag. She was terrified that this happiness was fleeting, a beautiful dream from which she would inevitably wake up. How could a man like Alexander Sterling truly want her? The insecure voice in her head, the one that sounded suspiciously like David, told her it was a fluke, a mistake. Sensing her inner turmoil, Alexander shifted, taking her face in his hands. "Hey," he said gently, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I know this is a lot. My world is not a simple one, and I know you're worried. But I need you to believe me when I tell you that you and this baby are the most important things in my life. Nothing and no one will ever touch you, I promise." His sincerity was a powerful balm. She leaned in and kissed him, a deep, grateful kiss that conveyed all the words she couldn't say. This was her sanctuary, right here in his arms. But even in this perfect moment, a shadow lingered at the edge of her consciousness. Alexander's world might be a sanctuary, but it also had walls, and she knew very little about what lay beyond them. He was an intensely private man. He spoke little of his family, other than to say his relationship with his father was complicated. He had business rivals, people whose names appeared in headlines alongside accusations of hostile takeovers and corporate espionage. Just last week, while they were having lunch in a quiet cafe, a woman had approached their table. She was stunningly beautiful, dressed in designer clothes with an air of cold, polished perfection. Her name was Catherine DeWitt, and the look she'd given Olivia was one of pure, unadulterated venom. She had spoken to Alexander in low, urgent tones, mentioning his father and a merger that was at risk. Alexander had been polite but firm, dismissing her quickly. When Olivia had asked who she was, he had simply said, "The daughter of a business associate. It's not important." But it had felt important. It had felt like a warning. There were hidden motives at play in Alexander's life, powerful forces she didn't understand. She was stepping into a world of immense wealth and influence, and with that came dangers she couldn't foresee. Was Catherine a spurned lover, a business rival, or something else entirely? Olivia knew with a chilling certainty that her greatest threat might not be the ghost of her past, David. It might be the unforeseen complexities of her future with Alexander. She was pregnant with the heir to the Sterling fortune. That fact alone made her a target. For now, she pushed the fear away, focusing on the solid warmth of Alexander's arms around her, the steady beat of his heart against her ear. He was her protector, her partner. Together, they could face anything. But as she closed her eyes, the image of Catherine DeWitt's cold, calculating stare flashed in her mind. David had tried to break her spirit with words. She had a terrifying feeling that the players in Alexander's world played a much more dangerous game. Olivia's life settled into a peaceful bubble, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. Alexander was becoming more and more a part of her daily existence. He'd started picking her up from the bookstore in the evenings, and they'd take long walks along the Battery, watching the dolphins play in the harbor as the sun set. He was endlessly fascinated by her pregnancy, constantly asking about the baby's movements, reading books on fetal development, and talking to her belly in low, soothing tones. He was also beginning to open up about the pressures of his own life. He told her about his father, Arthur Sterling, a ruthless patriarch who saw his son as little more than a tool to expand the family empire. Arthur was pushing for a merger with DeWitt Industries, a move that would consolidate their power but went against Alexander's more ethical business principles. Catherine DeWitt is her father's mouthpiece, Alexander explained one evening, his expression grim. They believe the best way to seal the deal is through a more traditional alliance. Olivia's blood ran cold. You mean they want you to marry her? He nodded, his jaw tight. It's been the assumption in our circles for years. A loveless strategic union. My father sees it as a brilliant move. I see it as a prison sentence. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. Which is why you and this baby are my anchor. You're my real life, Olivia. Everything else is just noise. His words were reassuring, but they also confirmed her fears. Catherine DeWitt wasn't just a jealous ex. She was a key player in a high-stakes corporate drama, a woman who likely saw Olivia as a direct threat to her ambitions. The incident at the cafe had not been a random display of animosity. It was a warning shot. Despite the looming shadows of Alexander's world, Olivia allowed herself to feel a sense of security she hadn't known in years. David seemed to have vanished, and the ugliness of their encounter at the coffee shop began to fade like a bad dream. She focused on the present, on the flutter of her baby's kicks, on the warmth of Alexander's hand in hers, on the exciting plans for her new art gallery. The peace felt real, earned. She was spending a Thursday off in the small studio apartment she still kept, a space that was entirely her own. It was her sanctuary from the grandeur of Riverwood, a place where she could still feel like the person she was before Alexander. She was sketching designs for her dream art space, a combination gallery, studio, and coffee shop, when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, expecting it to be Alexander. It was a text from an unknown number. Her brow furrowed as she read the words. We need to talk. I know everything. Meet me at the waterfront park in an hour. Come alone. There was no signature, but a shard of ice slid through her veins. She didn't need one. The cold, commanding tone was unmistakably David's. I know everything. The peaceful bubble she had so carefully constructed shattered in an instant. The words on the screen seemed to burn into Olivia's mind. I know everything. Did he know about the baby? How could he? She had been so careful. A sick, creeping dread began to pool in her stomach. Ignoring him wasn't an option. David wasn't the type to make idle threats. If he didn't get what he wanted, he would escalate. He would find a way to reach her at the bookstore or worse, at Riverwood. She had to face him, if only to protect Alexander from being dragged into her messy past. An hour later, she found him sitting on a bench overlooking the Cooper River, the afternoon sun glinting off his perfectly styled hair. He looked calm, controlled, like a predator waiting for its prey. He didn't stand as she approached, just watched her with a cold, triumphant gleam in his eyes. Olivia, he said, his voice smooth as silk, you look maternal. It suits you. His words confirmed her worst fears. He knew. How? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. She refused to sit next to him, standing before him like a defendant before a judge. He gestured vaguely. I have my ways. You're not as clever at hiding things as you think you are. Alexander Sterling, I have to admit, I'm impressed. I underestimated you. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. Or maybe I overestimated him. He must have a thing for charity cases. The insult was meant to throw her off balance, to remind her of her place in his eyes. But Olivia's fear was quickly being replaced by a cold, protective fury. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about her child. What do you want, David? She asked, her voice gaining strength. What do I want? He laughed, a short, humorless sound. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or in your case, the billion-dollar question. He finally stood up, circling her slowly. Here's the situation as I see it. You, my quiet, unassuming ex-wife, are carrying the heir to one of the largest fortunes on the East Coast. An heir, I might add, that was conceived out of wedlock. That's a messy little situation for a man as private as Alexander Sterling. The tabloids would have a field day. Billionaire bachelor knocks up bookstore clerk. It has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Her stomach churned. He was laying out his blackmail plot with chilling precision. This was a psychological battle, and he was using her deepest fears as his weapons. The fear of public humiliation, the fear of bringing scandal into Alexander's life, the fear of being seen as the gold digger David was painting her to be. "He loves me," she said, the words feeling flimsy against his onslaught of cynicism. "Oh, I'm sure he does," David sneered. "Men like him love a good project. But love doesn't stand up to a media firestorm. It doesn't stand up to the pressure from his board of directors, from his powerful old money family. They'll see you for what you are. A liability. A complication that needs to be managed." He stopped in front of her, his face inches from hers. "But I can be the solution," he whispered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "I'm the ex-husband. I can be the respectable, concerned third party. I can help you navigate this. We can present a united front." Olivia stared at him, bewildered. "A united front? What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about our future. Your future. The baby's future," he said, a manic energy in his eyes. "You're in over your head, Liv. You don't know how to play in that league. But I do. You need me to protect you, to represent your interests." The sheer audacity of his proposal was breathtaking. He wasn't just asking for a payout. He was trying to insert himself back into her life, into her relationship with Alexander, positioning himself as her manager, her gatekeeper. He wanted a piece of the power, the influence, the money. He saw her and her unborn child as his ticket to the world he'd always craved. It was the ultimate act of parasitic opportunism. You're insane," she breathed, taking a step back. "I'm a pragmatist," he shot back, his mask of civility slipping to reveal the raw, desperate ambition beneath. "Do you have any idea what this child represents? It's not just a baby. It's an asset. It's leverage. And you're about to be eaten alive by sharks if you don't have someone in your corner." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "Think about it, Olivia. This is our chance. Everything I tried to build, everything we lost, we can get it all back 1,000 times over. You just have to be smart. You have to let me help you." His touch was like a jolt of electricity, transporting her back to all the times he had grabbed her, pushed her, intimidated her into submission. But she wasn't that woman anymore. The life growing inside her, the love she felt from Alexander, they had forged a new spine of steel within her. She wrenched her arm from his grasp. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a finality that startled them both. "You will not touch me. You will not come near my child. And you will not use us to crawl your way out of the gutter you've dug for yourself." "You're making a mistake," he hissed, his face contorted with rage. "You're being naive. I can protect you, or I can expose you. The choice is yours." "That's not a choice," Olivia said, her gaze unwavering. "It's a threat, and I'm not afraid of you anymore, David. You have nothing that I want. You are nothing to me." She turned and walked away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't know if he was bluffing or if he would truly go to the press. She only knew that capitulating to him was not an option. He hadn't just threatened her, he had threatened her child. He had looked at the most precious thing in her life and seen only an asset, a pawn in his pathetic game. As she hurried away, a terrifying question echoed in her mind. What would David's next move be? And how could she possibly fight a man who knew all of her weaknesses because he was the one who had created them? Olivia felt a tremor of fear in her hands all the way back to Riverwood. She found Alexander in the library, and the sight of him calm and solid in the firelight was enough to make her composure crumble. In a torrent of tears and halting words, she told him everything: David's text, the meeting at the park, the blackmail, the disgusting proposal that he manage her and the baby. Alexander listened without interruption, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury she had never seen before. He remained perfectly still, his arm a solid, comforting weight around her, but she could feel the rage radiating from him. When she finished, her voice choked with sobs. He gently tilted her chin up to look at him. "Thank you for telling me," he said, his voice low and steady. "You did the right thing. You were incredibly brave." "I'm so sorry, Alex," she whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't want to bring this into your life. He's going to go to the press. I know he is. He's going to ruin everything." "Shh," he soothed, wiping her tears away with his thumb. "Listen to me. He is not going to ruin anything. He is a fly buzzing against a window pane, Olivia. Annoying, but ultimately powerless. You have not brought a problem into my life. You have brought a light into it. This is my fight now, too." He spoke with such absolute certainty that her sobs began to subside. In her world, a threat like David was a catastrophic event. In his, it seemed to be merely a variable to be controlled. He insisted she go upstairs and take a warm bath, promising he would handle everything. Olivia was too exhausted and emotionally drained to argue. As she soaked in the tub, she felt a profound sense of helplessness. She had placed this enormous, ugly problem in Alexander's hands, trusting him completely, yet she had no idea what he could possibly do. She couldn't imagine a world where a man like David could be silenced so easily. Later that night, as she lay in their bed, she heard the low murmur of his voice from his study down the hall. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was calm, decisive, and utterly cold. It was a side of him she had never heard before, the voice of a man accustomed to command. She fell into an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with flashing cameras and David's smirking face. The next morning, Alexander was a picture of calm. He didn't mention David or the threats. He spoke of plans for the nursery and asked for her opinion on a new philanthropic project. It was so normal, it was unnerving. "What did you do?" she finally asked, her voice small. He paused, setting down his coffee cup, and took her hand. "I built a wall," he replied, his gaze soft. "A quiet one. He won't be bothering you again." And that was all he said. There were no details, no explanations of his methods. She had to simply trust him. The days that followed were silent. Her phone remained quiet. No reporters appeared at the bookstore. No scandalous headlines surfaced online. David Prescott simply ceased to exist in her world. It was both terrifying and deeply comforting. She couldn't see the walls of the fortress Alexander had built around her, but she could feel its effects. She was safe. For the first time, she began to understand the nature of his power. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was silent, invisible, and absolute. The battle with David seemed to be over, but a small part of her wondered, with a shiver of apprehension, what other wars Alexander had to fight to keep their world secure. For 2 weeks, a fragile peace settled over Riverwood. The quiet held, and David vanished from Olivia's life as completely as if he had never existed. She began to breathe easier, the constant knot of anxiety in her stomach slowly unclenching. She allowed herself to believe that the worst was over, that they had weathered the storm. She and Alexander fell into a comfortable domestic rhythm. They spent their evenings assembling a crib in the nursery, a beautiful airy room painted a soft sage green, with a hand-painted mural of the low-country landscape on one wall. Olivia finally felt safe enough to indulge in the simple joys of her pregnancy, picking out tiny onesies and debating names with Alexander. The art space she had been dreaming of was also beginning to take shape. Alexander had, as a surprise, purchased a small, charming brick building in the historic district for her. He hadn't just given it to her. He'd made her a majority partner in a new LLC, insisting it be her business, her vision. For the first time, she felt a sense of purpose and autonomy that had nothing to do with being David's wife or Alexander's partner. It was hers alone. But the peace was an illusion, a calm sea before a hurricane. The true threat had not been vanquished. It had merely been lying in wait. The catalyst was a large charity gala hosted by the Sterling Foundation. Alexander had been reluctant for her to attend, wanting to shield her from the prying eyes and vicious gossip of his social circle. But Olivia had insisted. She was tired of hiding. She was the mother of his child, and she refused to be kept like a secret. She wanted to stand by his side, not as a bookstore clerk he was slumming with, but as his partner. She chose her dress carefully, a custom-made empire waist gown in a deep emerald green that complemented her growing belly without hiding it. For the first time she was showing her pregnancy to the world, and it felt like a declaration of strength. The moment they entered the ballroom of the Charleston Place Hotel, a hush fell over the crowd. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Olivia could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, their gazes a mixture of shock, curiosity, and undisguised disapproval. She saw the whispers exchanged behind champagne flutes, the pointed looks, the cold, assessing stares. It was far more intimidating than she had imagined. Alexander's hand was a warm, steady presence on the small of her back, guiding her through the throng. He greeted people with a polite, detached coolness, his body language a clear message. She is with me. She is untouchable. They were making their way towards the terrace when a figure blocked their path. It was Catherine DeWitt, looking like a queen of ice in a shimmering silver gown. Her smile was sharp and predatory. Beside her stood an older, formidable-looking man with cold, calculating eyes and an air of absolute authority. Olivia recognized him instantly from photos. Arthur Sterling, Alexander's father. "Alexander," Arthur said, his voice a low growl that commanded attention. He ignored Olivia completely, his gaze fixed on his son. "You're making a spectacle." "Father," Alexander replied, his own voice dropping to a dangerously quiet tone. "This is Olivia Shaw." Arthur Sterling's eyes flickered to Olivia for a fraction of a second, his expression one of utter disdain. It was a dismissal so profound it was like being erased. He turned back to Alexander. "We need to talk. Now. Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of Olivia," Alexander stated, his arm tightening protectively around her. A cruel smile played on Catherine's lips. "Oh, I think this is about Olivia," she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "Tell him, Arthur. Tell him what your investigators discovered about his precious little secret." Alexander went rigid. "What are you talking about?" Arthur's gaze was like granite. "We know about the ex-husband, Alexander. We know about the blackmail." He took a deliberate step closer, his voice dropping so only they could hear. "We know that this woman's sordid past almost brought a public scandal to our family's doorstep. A scandal you covered up." Olivia felt the blood drain from her face. They knew. But how? Alexander's actions had been so discreet. "And that's not all," Catherine interjected, her eyes sparkling with malice as she delivered the killing blow. "It seems her ex-husband, Mr. Prescott, has had a sudden change of fortune. His consulting firm just landed a major investment from DeWitt Industries." The world tilted on its axis. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. David hadn't just disappeared. He had been bought. Catherine and Arthur had found her weak spot, the one person in the world who held a grudge against her, and they had armed him. They had paid him off, not to stay silent, but to feed them information. The entire confrontation in the park, the blackmail. It was possible it had all been a setup, a performance designed to test Alexander's reaction, to see how much he was willing to cover up for her. David's betrayal was not just his own. It had been sponsored, orchestrated by the very people standing in front of her. "You're involved with him," Alexander directed at Catherine, his voice seething with a rage so cold it was terrifying. "Business is business," Catherine said with a shrug. "He was a desperate man, and desperate men are so useful. He told us everything, how she trapped you, how he tried to warn you. It was a lie, a twisted, venomous version of the truth designed to poison everything. They weren't just attacking her, they were attacking her credibility, her character, her love for Alexander. They were painting her as a manipulative gold digger, a liability, a stain on the Sterling name. "This changes nothing," Alexander said, his voice like ice. "It changes everything," Arthur Sterling boomed, his control finally snapping. "I will not have this family's legacy tied to a fortune-hunting tramp with a grifter for an ex-husband. You will end this ridiculous affair tonight. You will announce your engagement to Catherine by the end of the week, as planned. The child can be provided for, handsomely, but it will not bear the Sterling name." The cruelty of his words was staggering. He was talking about her baby as if it were a business expense to be managed, a problem to be paid off and hidden away. This was the true face of their world, a world of gilded serpents, where love was a weakness and children were assets. It was a world that would chew Olivia up and spit her out without a second thought. She looked at Alexander, and for the first time she saw the weight of the golden cage he had been born into. She saw the immense pressure, the impossible expectations, the cold, loveless future his father had mapped out for him. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't let him fight this battle for her. She couldn't be the damsel in his fortress any longer. If she did, she would prove them right. She would be the weakness they claimed she was. With a deep breath, she gently removed Alexander's hand from her back and took a small step forward, meeting Arthur Sterling's icy gaze with her own. "You're wrong about me," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tension. "And you've underestimated your son. But most of all, you've underestimated the mother of your grandchild." Olivia's voice, though quiet, resonated with an unshakable strength that commanded the attention of the three powerful people before her. For a moment, even Arthur Sterling seemed taken aback by her audacity. Catherine's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of disbelief. Alexander looked at Olivia with a mixture of shock and profound admiration. This was not the timid, wounded woman he had met in the bookstore. This was someone new, someone forged in the fires of her past and strengthened by the love for her future. This was her redemption, not from David, not from her past mistakes, but from the person they had all tried to make her be, small, silent, and manageable. Her redemption was the act of reclaiming her own voice, her own narrative. "Let me be very clear, Mr. Sterling," Olivia continued, her gaze locked on Arthur. "I am not an affair. I am the woman your son loves. This baby," she placed a hand firmly on her belly, "is not a complication. He or she is your grandchild, and we will not be provided for and hidden away." She then turned her attention to Catherine, her eyes holding none of the fear or intimidation she had once felt. "And you think you can buy and manipulate people to get what you want. You made a deal with a desperate, pathetic man to try and ruin me. But all you did was show me exactly who you are, a woman so insecure in her own worth that she has to destroy someone else's happiness to feel powerful. Alexander would never love a person like you, not because of me, but because he is a good man, something you and his father seem to know very little about." Every word was a declaration of independence. She wasn't leaning on Alexander's power. She was standing in her own. She was no longer defined by David's abuse or by the Sterling family's judgment. She was a mother, a partner, an entrepreneur, and a woman who had finally realized her own worth. "This is a family matter," Arthur growled, recovering his composure. He waved a dismissive hand at her. "It has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," Olivia countered calmly. "You're about to make a decision that will affect the rest of your son's life and the life of your grandchild. You see me as a threat to your legacy. But what kind of legacy are you building? One of cold, loveless business deals and broken relationships, or one that has room for happiness, for love?" She looked at Alexander, her eyes softening. "I fell in love with your son before I knew his last name. I fell in love with his kindness, his quiet strength, his brilliant mind. I don't need the Sterling money or the Sterling name. I just need him. And if he chooses to walk away from all of this to be with me and our child, then your legacy will be an empty one. You will have a powerful company, but you will have lost your son. A heavy silence descended. Olivia had laid all her cards on the table. She hadn't threatened or postured. She had simply spoken the truth, a truth so powerful and genuine that it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the gilded ballroom. She had reframed the conflict not as a battle for money or power, but as a choice between two futures for Alexander, one of loveless duty and one of authentic happiness. Alexander finally broke the silence. He stepped forward, taking Olivia's hand and lacing his fingers through hers. He didn't look at his father or Catherine. He looked only at Olivia, his eyes filled with a love and pride so immense it was palpable. "She's right," he said, his voice clear and resonant. "For my entire life, I have done what was expected of me. I have managed the family business. I have upheld the family name. I have tolerated the alliances and the expectations. But I will not sacrifice my family for this company. Olivia and our child are my family. They are my legacy." He then turned to his father, his gaze hard as steel. "The merger with DeWitt Industries is off. Our engagement," he said, looking at Catherine with cold finality, "is, and has always been, a fiction. You will have no further contact with Olivia, and you will sever all ties with David Prescott. If I hear that he has so much as breathed in her direction, I will personally dismantle everything he has ever built and everything he ever hopes to build. As for you, father, you have a choice to make. You can be a grandfather to my child, or you can be a stranger, but you will not dictate the terms of my life any longer." Without waiting for a response, Alexander turned, keeping Olivia's hand firmly in his, and led her away. They walked through the stunned, silent crowd, a united front of two people who had chosen love over power and a future of their own making over one dictated by others. They didn't look back. As they stepped out into the cool, jasmine-scented night air, Olivia leaned her head against Alexander's shoulder, a single happy tear tracing a path down her cheek. The battle was over. There would be fallout, of course. She knew Arthur Sterling was not a man who took defeat lightly. But it no longer mattered. They had faced the gilded serpents in their own den and had walked away, not just unscathed, but stronger. David's insult in the coffee shop seemed like a lifetime ago. He had called her fat, tried to make her feel worthless and small. He had seen her as a discarded object he could still control. But he had been so wrong. Her body was not a source of shame. It was a vessel of life, a testament to a new beginning. She had found her power not in a man's wealth, but within herself. She was Olivia Shaw, a woman who had survived a gilded cage, faced down a dynasty, and was about to build a life and a family on her own terms. And that was a story worth telling. From a cruel insult in a coffee shop to a courageous stand against a powerful dynasty, Olivia's story is a powerful testament to reclaiming one's own narrative. She proved that true worth isn't defined by an ex-husband's taunts or a billionaire's fortune, but by the strength to find your own voice and fight for the future you deserve. Her journey from victim to victor is a reminder that the quietest people can have the strongest resilience. If you were moved by Olivia's emotional battle for her family and her freedom, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with anyone who needs to be reminded of their own inner power. And for more unforgettable stories of betrayal, love, and redemption, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll see you for the next story.